Welcome to Diseases of History, and today is a pretty unique disease in the sense that this is a pathogen of plants that has a massive impact on humans. And doing this, I feel a bit like Max Miller's Wario. If by some chance Max Miller is watching this, I'd be down to do go-karts. But today we're talking the potato blight, the Great Famine, and its role leading up to the revolutions of 1848. Now, this won't be a complete story, it's more the background and introduction to the next month or so of specials, but bear with me. And let's start by talking about the humble potato. Now, potatoes are native to South America. You will not find a wild potato in Ireland. And early potatoes were just cultivated as garden crops among the wealthy. So they were first brought over by the Spanish in the second half of the 16th century. They're then gradually traded around Europe. But they gradually become pretty popular among lower classes because they're quite water efficient, they're relatively hardy, and they produce a lot of nutrition per unit of land. They're also state evading. See, when you have an extractive state that's collecting taxes on your crops, it's really hard to appropriate root vegetables. And being a tuber, potatoes can be left in the ground once they're ripe and dug up and used as needed. Other crops tend to need to be picked within a relatively narrow time frame. So when your landlord wants your potato crop, they have to go about digging up each one. Potatoes are brought to Ireland around 1585, and by 1635 they'd become a major foodstuff. Although at the time the Irish diet is still pretty heavily dairy-based. However, under the English colonial system, that traditional diet starts to become less available. So in 1663, the British passed a tariff on cattle coming over from Ireland, shortly followed by an embargo on cattle, pigs, and sheep. And this is Oliver Cromwell. He leads the invasion of Ireland from 1649 to 1650. And following the conquest of Ireland, he distributes a ton of land to wealthy English landlords. And so under this system, a lot of our Irish peasantry becomes tenant farmers. And as the English continue to extract all the crops grown in Ireland, they turn to potatoes. They start growing potatoes in these raised beds, and they needed relatively little work compared to other crops. See, the peasants are working long hours for their absentee landlords, and so this enables them to feed their families while still producing enough to serve the landlord. And so animal agriculture's importance decreases, and the potato, specifically the Irish lumper, becomes a central food source. So they're living off of potatoes and exporting nearly all of their other food. So at this point, let's talk about the pathogen of interest. So this is the late potato blight, or Phytopthora infestans. And this is an omycete. We've talked about omycetes in Journal Club a fair bit, most recently infecting the giant isopod. We also talked a while ago about Pythium insidiosum, also known as swamp cancer, that can affect dogs and horses. But this one in particular is a pathogen of Solanaceae, so it infects potatoes and tomatoes and their relatives. It likes to collect on the leaves and stems where the dew collects, and it produces these downy white colonies composed of sporangia, which then release new spores to go off and spread the infection. They also produce this white mycelium on the surface of the tubers, which then opens the door to secondary bacterial rots. Now, potatoes are native to Central America, and the potato blight omycete probably originated in Mexico or in the Andes. We know that in the 1840s it starts making its way up into North America. The first recorded instance of the disease in North America is in Philadelphia and New York City in 1843. The spores then end up spread by wind up the coast into Canada by 1845. Also in 1845, it crosses the Atlantic in a shipment of seed potatoes meant for Belgium. And this year the potato harvest fails in Belgium. The blight then goes on to spread throughout Europe, and here it does a 1-2 punch to Ireland. The rainy climate there favors growth of the pathogen, while that monoculture of Irish lumpers fails to hinder its spread. And coupled with the ongoing burden from extractive capitalism, the Irish begin to starve despite having successful harvests of their other crops. Now, the Tory government initially ships maize and cornmeal from the United States, although years of having corn tariffs intended to reduce the import of cheaper grains meant that the Irish mills were not equipped to process that maize. Then in 1846, the Whigs take power in London, and they refuse to offer aid to Ireland, citing the famine as divine judgment. By 1847, this policy starts to cut into their profits. People are leaving Ireland or dying, and so they start providing aid through workhouse systems and soup kitchens. Of course, this isn't given freely, so the Irish poor laws start leading to evictions on the tenant farmers. Meanwhile, there's something called the Gregory Clause, which prohibits farmers who own land from qualifying for that public relief. So it ends up driving people off the land and putting more of that land into the hands of the British speculators. Now, this series so far tends to look at how humans overcome these diseases, and sorry to break it to you, but we sort of haven't. We've managed to produce some blight-resistant varieties. And good biosecurity can help reduce the spread, but it still pops up and causes about $6 billion in crop damage each year. Now, some blights are easier to get rid of than others, because when the potato blight returns in 1879, the Irish Home Rule League physically blocks the eviction of farmers, and they start boycotting absentee landlords. This blunts the economic impact of the crop failure and ends up saving lives. And here's where our story starts to branch off. See, the famine absolutely hit Ireland the worst. It caused up to 1 million deaths and created up to 2 million refugees. But it spread throughout Europe and hit places like France, Prussia, and Belgium especially hard. In Prussia, the failed potato harvest was combined with heavy spring rains followed by drought, which led to widespread crop failures. And so the loss of the ever-dependable potato hit especially hard. At the same time, the Prussian government had bought up all the grain stocks in the major cities to help avoid shortages. They'd also tried to buy grain from other countries, but ended up buying spoiled grain from Russia. But potatoes were still being diverted into use for producing schnapps, and so the costs of potatoes and grain both skyrocket. This gets compounded by bakers who fail to meet regulations for bread prices. And so food shortages break out. Hungry workers flee into the cities seeking work in factories, which depresses the wages, and folks begin to starve. So on April 21st, food riots break out in Berlin. Now these are eventually quelled by the military, and short-term measures are put in place to bring down the cost of food, limit the export and processing of potatoes for schnapps, and create short-term employment. But this potato revolution brings about that first taste of a hungry populace turning against the state. And that's where we'll leave you for the week. Admittedly, this is pretty bleak, and we'll continue the story from a couple different perspectives over the next month. So keep an eye out for the National History Day specials as well as next month's Diseases of History.